Thank you, Sarah. Hello again to everybody, and thank you for joining this conversation. I am going to demonstrate Andy's point in that I come mostly with questions, and a large part of this week is about getting as many perspectives to this conversation as possible because I'm looking for some answers. And as Sarah pointed out, we've been building on some different topics, looking at mining and mineral operations sort of from the inside, and then how does all of that world connect to a whole universe of stakeholders, and how do we build trust, but also how does that trust feature in redesigning various systems? And all of that kind of led us this year to thinking, okay, well, there's a lot of words being thrown around that mean very specific things to very specific groups. De-risking is one that's high on the agenda. It's a big part of my work at the moment because I do a lot of work with policy shapers. And when you work with risk management consultants, you become a little sensitive to how that word is used, particularly when it's misused. And I think what I was hoping to put on the table for our conversation today is behind all this talk of de-risking, what's actually meant or intended? Is it actually happening? And more importantly, what does it actually mean for mining and mineral operations worldwide? And how we can, as is the stated intent of everybody, who's sharing this conversation, improve responsibility. So I sort of wanted to start by just putting this word de-risking on the table. We've all heard a lot of the policy talk, de-risking coming out of the US as a sort of follow-on from the word decoupling. The basic idea hinges on, first of all, some user markets of minerals redesigning their supply chains in a way that their industry is less at risk from concentration, which also means redesigning some of their relationships with other countries or other states or other regions to expand the choice of providers. So that's a big sort of policy meaning. But the fact is the word de-risking actually comes from investment. It actually comes from a lot of the mechanics that we've seen, not just in investment, but also in, banking, in a lot of the project management, operations management that we've all been, focused on for years. So I thought the first thing we could look at is, of all the policy statements about this de-risking of mineral value chains, i.e. creating more diversity in mineral value chains and more options for some buyer markets, are we anywhere near achieving those objectives? And frankly, it kind of seems that not only we're not nearer, but we're perhaps even moving backwards. So I can share the link in the chat of a report from the Bank for International Settlements. Bank for International Settlements is basically a bank for central banks. It's a cooperation platform where not only do they exchange data, but they determine, joint initiatives for monetary and financial stability. So these are like serious people, okay? These good people at BIS put out a report, I think last October or November. No, sorry, it was earlier this year, because it compares the state of global value chains, not specific to minerals, but value chains in general, in between December 2021 and September 2023. So these are 2 years where the narrative on value chains, on de-risking, has been, constant. And yet what they show is that value chains have not necessarily diversified. but they've lengthened. So instead of more direct cross-border reliance, we have more and more buyers in some markets, they specifically highlight the US, who remain connected to producers in the original markets of either production of raw materials or processing, but simply with more intermediate levels. So what's happening is that there's a response to the de-risking narrative, but we're not actually creating new sources or new nodes of production of the goods in these global value chains. If we apply that to mining and minerals, it's quite a stark picture, because what it effectively means is that we are not at all achieving the objective of reducing reliance on some countries. Let's be honest, the elephant in the room is China. Everybody talks about the Chinese risk. We're not decreasing reliance, but at the same time, we are adding intermediate levels between China and some of its end consumers. This is not exactly the narrative of creating new opportunities. This doesn't fit the narrative of criticality, magically creating new markets for these minerals. So if we think about what that means in terms of other uses of the word de-risking, then fundamentally we arrive at the meaning that we use for investment purposes. And it's very clear that there is a huge reticence to invest in mining and minerals. First of all, it's a small investment universe. Second of all, let's be honest, the last super cycle did not make us investors' darlings. So we are currently under scrutiny. And investors are very clear when they say, no, we want mining to apply stringent capital discipline. Do not waste our money the way you did in the last super cycle. And then there were write-offs in the billions. This is not exactly conducive to growth in an industry where we actually need risk capital just to live. Exploration is fundamentally the epitome of risk capital. We're not spending on exploration. The market wobbles of the last 6-9 months have demonstrated that criticality does not make a market, and it certainly does not make a super cycle. So where are we going with all of this? One of the options that a lot of the policy shapers who are talking about this de-risking in a wider sense, one of the options that they're pursuing is applying public capital to sort of shore up or unlock private sector capital. And there's lots of different approaches. Some are sort of direct checkbook, so US incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act, expanding worldwide via a network of free trade agreements. Okay. There are other checkbook approaches which actually don't even refer to state agreements. Saudi Arabia created a state-owned vehicle to which it then added some private investors who have their own sort of credentials in terms of why they're present in the game. But the ultimate aim is very clear and stated openly. This is to source feed for an emerging Saudi processing capacity. So all of these different approaches are shifting the dial somewhat, but they're definitely not changing the game. So one of my key problems is, how do we look at this sort of big picture in a context where the very industry we're talking about is itself undergoing massive transformation? The way we explore, the way we mine, the way we process, the linkages between these operations, even if they're not shifting as quickly as we'd like, because we haven't redesigned value chains in the last 3 to 4 years, the fact is they will have to evolve. There is no doubt about that. If only because planetary boundaries are not negotiable. I'm a lawyer, recovering lawyer. So as you know, 2 and 2 can make 5. It's all a question of what we agree. But the thing is, you can't negotiate with nature any more than we already have. So at this point, we've got a mining and mineral sector that is underfunded to deliver to huge expectations, but also facing its own internal transition. We've been talking about the skills issue in mining and minerals for 10 years. It's no longer a risk. It's here. It's here. The generation of operational middle management that we would need to actually be able to develop some of the new operations, if we could fund them, that generation doesn't exist because they weren't in the market before and after the super cycle. So as we're sort of, having these gears that connect with difficulty, I think one of the key points that I was hoping to address throughout this week is, what are we doing individually and collectively to not only achieve these investment objectives, these geostrategic goals of de-risking, but are we actually thinking about what they entail more widely? One of the inconsistencies is we keep talking about increasing processing capacity as a key element of de-risking. The last time we massively increased processing capacity, everyone in the world got their gold refinery. That led to the biggest gold rush in history and the emergence of illegal gold mining and all of its, links to organized crime, terrorism, and state destabilization. So I think one of the key elements that I'm looking for across this whole conversation this week is, how do we stand by the statements of improving and increasing responsibility? How do we also convey to the wider world that there is no resilience without responsibility, but that responsibility also entails working together rather than having, these set slogans, whether you're pro or anti-mining? Frankly, who cares? The fact is, we need to do this and we need to do it well. It's not a question of which one takes precedence. It's a question of how we arbitrage competing priorities and competing interests. So long story short, I don't quite know, but I think these are the questions of the time, and I look forward to some of your answers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ludivine. Absolutely amazing as always. Everybody, please put your hands together for the fabulous Ludivine Wouters. Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Now, Ludivine, we have got a few minutes before we need to go to our next speaker. And I know that there are a number of questions and comments that have been coming in the chat here in Zoom, but also as well through some of our other channels. Now, Ludivine, you mentioned that in terms of responsibility, but then also that resilience throughout our value chains, it requires all of us to come together. Now, with this, if we go and look at, say, those industries that make use of a lot of our raw materials, there are a huge number of different standards or requirements on, say, responsible sourcing, etc. So it's almost the fingers are pointing up the value chain towards the mining companies. Do you feel that actually that partnership that's needed between those primary raw material producers and then the industries that actually make use of the raw materials, do you think that's balanced enough, or do you think it is weighted one way or the other? What do you reckon?
Nice question. I think everybody has their own answer on this, but I see two things. The first one is, there are competing models in terms of how to do this efficiently. And let's be honest, the vertically integrated model that comes from having a state-led economy, yes, I'm talking about China, has created huge efficiency, has empowered this Chinese industry to be wholly reliant on a very efficient value chain where, because it's very integrated, different levels can afford to take a hit on profitability, on positioning. But the thing is that there's there's no such state control in value chains that end in market economies, because that's just not how we've operated. And particularly in minerals, because these value chains are so diverse. I mean, you know, a few years ago, remember, everybody had ESG expert on their card. Today, it's critical minerals expert. What does that mean? I mean, if you understand one of these value chains, you are a champion. You know, the EU defined 35 critical minerals. The US is 50. Nobody's an expert in all of these. So I think the difficulty is that we're looking at a lot of different value chains with very limited capacity for the traditional integration model. And what that means is that when we're looking at all these different levels, living in silos with their profitability drivers, with their investment pools completely separate, everybody's going to try to limit their accountability because they think that's the best way to increase their profitability, reduce their risk and exposure. But the reality is it doesn't really work. So we've got a huge push for responsibility all the way upstream. And I don't dispute that. I think mining has a lot of catch up, you know, to do, and must be accountable for what it does well and what it doesn't do well. But the reality is, come on, mining is the guy who's panning for gold in a river all the way up to the mega pit. Like, the diversity we're talking about in this situation is spectacular. And frankly, even if every single one of those actors can produce the mineral in the most responsible way on earth, we lose track of it in processing. Like, who are we kidding? Processing is dirty, energy intensive, opaque, the source of market opacity, which currently heightens and frankly maintains criticality. So at this stage, I'm saying, yes, we can't have integrated value chains. So we don't have the protection of that, and we still have to deal with responsibility. But we need a much more integrated thought process in terms of industrial policy. And even if we had much more visibility on processing and those linkages, if we're producing all those minerals perfectly, very responsibly, I'm sorry, I'm going to steal from one of my favorite people, Paul Ekins. If it's to produce a 2-ton SUV that's driven around London, then we have failed, because that's a poor use of these resources. So responsibility is different for every actor. The more we look at the linkages, the more we hold each other accountable. I'm fine being a responsible miner. I want industry to treat this product with the respect that it deserves.
Awesome. Thanks, Ludivine. Now, Andy, you have politely put your hand up. Do you want to ask your question? And Ludivine, you have approximately 90 seconds before we're going to go to our next speaker. So, Andy, go.
I will be quick.
It won't be an easy question, but it is, what might we learn from the Second World War, which is arguably the last time that market economies had to change the goals of raw material value chains?
Super interesting. I do not have any answer, but I love it, because what came out of World War II is the global governance institutions that we rely on today. If we want to talk about shifting models, we need to talk about shifting governance models. So I'm going to think about that, and let's discuss it in the panel. But I agree with you. When the market shifts, the whole policy landscape that responds to this market, houses it and protects it, shifts as well. I think the first part of a response to that is we probably need to rethink our rights and obligations on natural resources. Maybe let's talk about the 1962 UN resolution that defines sovereignty over mineral resources. And no, I'm not saying that in a neo-colonialist way. I'm saying we've come to a situation where the stakes are global and existential. Probably we need to put everything on the table.